Energy moves too slowly here. Nutrients arrive late, currents hesitate, growth happens on a timetable that feels outdated for a living system exposed to constant pressure. In this environment, stability is supposed to come from speed or aggression or sheer reproductive excess. It doesn't. The balance holds anyway. That contradiction exists before the animal even has a name. Only after that tension settles does Abalone enter the frame, not as a protagonist, but as a structural problem the ocean somehow solved. Abalone are not fast, not numerous, not adaptable in the way modern ecological winners usually are. Their movement is measured in centimeters per hour, their metabolism conserves energy to a fault, their shell growth records time rather than defying it. Nothing about this design suggests control, and yet, in cold coastal waters, abalone occupy a position that should belong to something far more aggressive. They feed on drifting kelp fragments, not by chasing, but by waiting. This passive consumption removes biomass at exactly the rate kelp forests can tolerate, preventing excess decay while leaving enough structure intact to regenerate. The unsettling part is that this balance has no buffer. Remove too many abalone and kelp detritus accumulates differently. Nutrient cycling shifts, grazing patterns change, and sea urchins begin to exploit the opening. Urchins are the opposite strategy. Dense populations, relentless feeding, rapid landscape conversion. They strip kelp forests to bare rock, creating urchin barrens that can persist for decades. Abalone are one of the few organisms that slow this transition, not by force, but by existing at just the right metabolic speed. It is an ecological role defined by timing, not strength. That role should be fragile. It should collapse under minor disturbance. It does not, at least not immediately. For thousands of years, this slow mollusk held a line it was never built to defend. The system worked because everything operated close to its minimum requirements: energy intake barely exceeding survival costs, reproduction paced for long-term averages rather than short-term shocks. This is where the discomfort begins. A system with no redundancy can look stable right up until the moment it isn't. Abalone cannot flee warming water, cannot rapidly shift diet, cannot replace lost generations quickly. Their larvae drift for weeks, vulnerable to temperature, acidity, and chance, before settling into a life defined by patience. There is no acceleration mechanism waiting to engage. The ocean did not design a backup. It simply assumed continuity. When humans later encountered abalone, they saw a resource that appeared renewable precisely because it was always there. Large shells, predictable locations, slow disappearance. That apparent abundance masked the fact that abalone populations were not resilient, they were merely untested. The fear is not that abalone are weak, the fear is that they are exact. Exact in how much energy they require, exact in how slowly they grow, exact in the role they fill. Exact systems do not forgive miscalculation. They do not signal distress until thresholds are crossed. Abalone feel like an animal that should have been replaced by something faster long ago. Instead, they remained, holding together a biological agreement written in slow motion. The question is not why they worked. The question is how long a system like this can survive once speed enters the equation. The math is supposed to be simple. Remove pressure and systems rebound. Reduce harvest, protect habitat, wait long enough, and biology fills the gap. That expectation is comfortable, and in this case, it is wrong. When abalone are removed, the ocean does not reset to an earlier state. It rearranges itself into something harder, less productive, and far more stable in the wrong direction. This is the first limit that feels deliberately hostile. Abalone grazing subtly regulates how energy moves through kelp forests, not by consuming living kelp directly, but by processing what breaks loose naturally. This keeps the seafloor from becoming a staging ground for opportunistic species. Once that regulation disappears, the system doesn't pause. Sea urchins expand into the vacuum, increasing in density until every available kelp holdfast becomes food. Their feeding rate outpaces kelp regrowth, converting three-dimensional forests into flat, nutrient-poor barrens. What makes this unsettling is not the destruction itself, but its permanence. Urchin barrens resist reversal. Even when fishing stops, even when predators return in limited numbers, the new state maintains itself through feedback loops that favor scarcity. Algae cannot re-establish because grazing pressure never drops low enough, and urchins persist on minimal energy intake, waiting out recovery attempts. The absence of abalone does not create space for something better. It creates a lock. This violates the intuition that ecosystems prefer complexity. In reality, they prefer whatever state consumes energy efficiently under current constraints. The barren does that very well. Abalone were part of a narrow corridor that kept the system just above collapse, and removing them pushes it past a point where previous rules apply. This reveals a second, colder truth. Conservation timelines often exceed biological patience. Abalone mature slowly, taking years to reproduce effectively, while urchins can maintain population pressure continuously. Protection measures operate on human schedules, seasons, quotas, funding cycles. The ocean operates on thresholds. Once crossed, it does not acknowledge intention. The idea that recovery is inevitable becomes a narrative imposed from outside the system. From inside, there is no concept of recovery, only persistence. Abalone populations, when reduced below a functional density, lose their ecological role even before they vanish completely. Individuals may remain, shells still visible, but the system behaves as if they are gone. This is not extinction as an event, but extinction as a loss of influence. It feels wrong because it is quiet. No mass die-off announces the shift. No dramatic change marks the moment the forest becomes a barren. It happens through accumulation, through delays, through the slow realization that removing a passive organism did not simplify the system, it hardened it. The ocean did not punish extraction with chaos, it responded with efficiency. That response is what makes reversal so difficult. Once the system learns it can function without abalone, it has no reason to relearn them. Time is the core constraint, and abalone are built to spend it carefully. Their bodies allocate energy toward shell deposition, tissue maintenance, and delayed reproduction, a strategy optimized for long, stable environments where survival probabilities remain consistent across decades. Sexual maturity can take several years, sometimes longer depending on temperature and food availability. This is not inefficiency, it is a precise calibration. Growth rates match historical mortality rates, creating a balance where replacement happens slowly but reliably. The problem emerges when mortality accelerates. Predation, disease, and especially human harvesting compress losses into timescales abalone physiology cannot match. There is no metabolic gear to shift into. Energy intake cannot suddenly increase. Shell growth cannot be paused without cost. Reproduction cannot be advanced without reducing survival. Every option carries a trade-off already accounted for by evolution under different conditions. In practical terms, this means abalone populations respond to pressure by thinning out, not by compensating. Larval output declines long before adults disappear, because fewer individuals reach the size and age required to reproduce. Fertilization itself depends on proximity. Broadcast spawning releases gametes into moving water, and success drops sharply as density decreases. Below a certain threshold, reproduction fails even if individuals remain healthy. This is not weakness. It is geometry. The body plan assumes neighbors. When those neighbors are removed, the system breaks at the level of probability, not physiology. This creates a disturbing asymmetry. Loss happens quickly, recovery happens slowly, and in between there is a long period where the species exists without functioning. From the outside, it looks like persistence. From the inside, it is a countdown measured in missed generations. Abalone shells record growth rings that can be read like a calendar, each band marking a period where energy was just sufficient to continue. These records show stress long before collapse, thinner layers, slower deposition, subtle signs that conditions are tightening. But nothing in the animal's behavior signals urgency. There is no visible struggle. This makes exploitation deceptively easy. A slow-growing organism appears abundant because it does not move away, because it does not resist, because it has been shaped to endure rather than evade. In a fast-consuming world, endurance is misinterpreted as surplus. The discomfort lies in realizing that abalone were never adapted to withstand rapid removal. They were adapted to withstand time. When time is taken away, their biology has no response except gradual failure. That failure does not look like death at first. It looks like stability. Value enters the system as an external force, and biology does not recognize it as artificial. Abalone are pulled into global trade networks not because of abundance, but because scarcity increases desirability. Their flesh becomes a luxury signal, their shells cultural artifacts, their rarity a multiplier rather than a deterrent. This is the paradox that collapses any remaining safety margin. A species that declines slowly becomes more valuable precisely because it is disappearing. From a biological perspective, this feedback loop is indistinguishable from a predation strategy with perfect information. Harvest pressure does not ease as populations drop. It intensifies. Illegal fishing targets the last dense pockets, removing the most reproductively valuable individuals, the large adults whose presence once stabilized fertilization and grazing dynamics. The system does not degrade evenly. It fractures. Local populations vanish while adjacent areas appear intact, creating the illusion of persistence. Enforcement operates on borders and seasons, but extraction follows biology, moving wherever density remains just high enough to justify risk. This transforms abalone from an ecological regulator into a transportable unit of stored energy, dehydrated, shelled, counted, and priced. None of these steps register within the ocean. The water does not respond differently to legal versus illegal removal. It only responds to absence. What makes this unsettling is how efficiently human networks exploit biological lag. Abalone declines are slow, measured in years, while trade operates in days. By the time population models confirm collapse, the economic logic has already moved on, leaving behind systems that no longer function but have not fully disappeared. In some regions, poaching pressure exceeds historical harvest levels several times over, not because demand increased proportionally, but because fewer animals now carry more value per unit. This pushes extraction into a phase where every remaining abalone matters biologically, and none matter economically as individuals. They matter only as aggregate weight. The ocean cannot counteract this. There is no evolutionary response fast enough to reduce visibility, accelerate reproduction, or devalue flesh. This is not coevolution, it is overwrite. The role abalone once played in regulating urchins and stabilizing kelp forests is replaced by a role they never evolved for, fueling a market detached from ecological consequence. The result feels fundamentally wrong because it is. A keystone species is converted into a contraband commodity, and the system that depended on its continued presence is left operating without one of its load-bearing structures. Collapse here is not dramatic. It is administrative. Paperwork fails, monitoring lags, and biology absorbs the outcome. By the time the trade becomes unsustainable, the ecosystem has already adapted to the absence, not recovered, adapted. An adaptation, in this context, means accepting a poorer, simpler state as the new equilibrium. Temperature shifts by a few degrees, and nothing appears to happen at first. Abalone continue feeding, shells still grow, the seafloor looks unchanged. But internally, the margin disappears. Their physiology is tuned to cold, stable water, where metabolic rates remain predictable and oxygen availability stays high. As temperatures rise, energy demand increases while dissolved oxygen drops. This forces a redistribution of resources inside the body, more energy to maintenance, less to growth and immune function. There is no emergency reserve to draw from. The system was never designed to run hotter. Into this narrowing space enters disease. Withering syndrome caused by a rickettsia-like bacterium exploits exactly this imbalance. It does not need to be especially aggressive. It only needs hosts already operating near their limits. Infected abalone lose the ability to absorb nutrients efficiently, leading to muscle atrophy and eventual detachment from the substrate. Death follows not from sudden failure, but from prolonged insufficiency. What makes this especially unsettling is how clean the math becomes. Slightly warmer water accelerates bacterial replication, slows host defense, and lengthens the time an individual spends in a compromised state. Mortality increases, not because conditions are extreme, but because they are just off. This creates a cascading effect at the population level. Fewer healthy adults mean lower reproductive output, which further reduces density, which in turn lowers fertilization success. Each step compounds the next. There is no dramatic tipping point, only a steady erosion of function. The system does not break loudly, it thins. Abalone can survive short-term stress, but chronic exposure recalibrates survival probabilities downward year after year. The fear comes from recognizing that nothing here violates biological rules. Every response is correct given the inputs. the outcome feels wrong only because it removes the illusion of resilience. A species that persisted for millennia under stable conditions has no obligation to survive rapid change. Warming water does not kill abalone outright. It removes their tolerance for everything else. Disease, predation, harvest, all become more effective simply because the body has less room to respond. This is what a system with no safety margin looks like. It continues functioning until it doesn't, and by the time failure is visible, the equations have already resolved themselves. At a certain point, absence becomes structural. Abalone do not need to go extinct for their role to vanish. They only need to fall below the density at which their behavior matters. This is where the final discomfort settles in. Conservation often frames survival as a binary state, alive or gone, protected or lost. The ocean does not. It operates on function. When abalone numbers drop too low to regulate detritus flow, to slow urchin expansion, to synchronize reproduction through proximity, the system behaves as if they are already finished. Individuals may still cling to rock, shells intact, metabolism steady, but influence has evaporated. Kelp forests no longer respond to their presence. Urchin barrens persist without resistance. From a biological perspective, this is not collapse, it is resolution. The system is settled into a configuration that no longer requires negotiation. What makes this hard to accept is that intervention after this point feels active, but changes little. Restocking programs add individuals into environments that no longer support their function. Protected areas preserve animals that cannot reassemble the dynamics that once gave them meaning. The ocean does not reward intent. It only responds to thresholds being crossed in the correct order. Abalone evolved to exist within a narrow band of conditions that held for thousands of years. Outside that band, they do not adapt aggressively. They simply persist until persistence no longer produces an effect. This exposes a final paradox. A species can survive biologically while being ecologically irrelevant. From the outside, this looks like success. From inside the system, it is indistinguishable from loss. The horror is not that the ocean is cruel, it is that it is precise. Every interaction follows rules that do not bend for cultural value, economic pressure, or conservation goals introduced late. Once abalone are no longer necessary, the system does not miss them. It does not grieve. It does not attempt to restore a previous state. It continues, leaner, flatter, and less complex, but stable. That stability is the most unsettling outcome. A world where kelp forests fail to return, where biodiversity contracts without triggering alarms, where a slow, exact organism remains physically present but functionally erased. This is not a story about extinction as an endpoint. It is about what happens before that word applies, when life continues but no longer matters in the way it once did. The ocean stops negotiating long before the last shell disappears.